All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining our event this evening. I'm Agnes Constante. I'm the secretary for AAJA LA, and I'll be moderating tonight's panel discussion on social media, navigating social media in journalism. I'm really looking forward to this discussion tonight. I think that knowing how to conduct ourselves as journalists online can be tricky. So really excited to be hearing from all of our panelists tonight. So over the next hour, we're going to be going over a broad range of topics, including best practices in social media. We'll also be talking about, the line between sharing your opinions online versus just calling out social injustices. As journalists, we're taught to be objective and to leave our biases out of our reporting. But where is the line with, being objective and also just calling out something that's an injustice? So we'll be diving into that a little bit. We'll also be talking about what it's like to develop a personal brand outside of work. And we'll also be hearing from our speakers talk about repercussions and benefits that they've experienced from posting on social media. So I just wanted to invite everybody that's tuning in at any point, please feel free to participate in the discussion through the chat if you want to share your own experiences with social media. And if you have any questions at any point, feel free to drop those into the chat as well. We'll leave a couple of minutes at the end of the discussion to answer as many of the questions as we can. And so I'm really excited to introduce the four speakers that we have. They're really great speakers, and I'm excited to hear from every one of them. We're going to be hearing from Adrienne Shih, who's the audience engagement editor for national politics at the LA Times and is based out of its Washington, D.C. bureau. We'll be hearing from Seth Liss, who is the deputy director for audience at the LA Times as well. We'll also be hearing from Kevin Nguyen, who is the content lead at Snapchat, and Kevin is also a former producer at BuzzFeed. And we'll be hearing from Traci Lee, who is the growth and insights editor for Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy at Sony Pictures Creative Center. Traci is also the former managing editor of NBC Asian America. So I think it'd be really great if we can dive into the discussion, just if we could hear from all of our panelists about how and why you use social media in journalism or in your current role. And if we could start with you, Adrienne, that would be great.
Yeah, so hi everyone. Social media is a really big part of my role. So as an audience engagement editor, I'm helping out our reporters and editors, specifically for me in our politics sections, to promote and amplify their work on social media. It's probably one of the biggest platforms that we use for story sharing. But social media is also kind of a good listening and journalistic, reporting tool for us. So in my job, I'm also helping all of our journalists with, how they present themselves on social, and then using social media as, a news gathering tool and really just an engagement tool to, talk to their followers, to answer any questions that their followers may have. And in that, I guess, also sort of brand building for themselves.
Great, thank you, Adrienne. Seth, could you share a little bit about your role and how and why you use social media in that role?
Sure. So I am the deputy director at the LA Times of audience, and so I work with a bunch of people in the different sections to do exactly what Addie just so perfectly explained, and try to get people into our stories, try to build community. Yeah, that's the gist of it. I think Addie did a good job there.
Great, thanks, Seth. And Kevin, can you share a little bit about how you use social media in your role? If you could talk, I guess, about how you used it when you were at BuzzFeed, and then now how that's different now that you're at Snapchat.
Yeah, absolutely. So currently I work at Snapchat, and previously I worked at BuzzFeed as a supervising producer. And when you work at BuzzFeed, you really wear a lot of different hats. And as a media publishing company, we work really closely with many different social media platforms to publish our content onto. And so we lived and breathed different social media platforms, from YouTube to Instagram to Twitter. And so it was really important for us to understand our audiences and how each audience is very different in how they interact with our content, and how can we create the most viral and most talked about pieces of content possible for these various different platforms. And how it's different now for me as I work at Snapchat is I am the social media. I'm no longer a specific media publisher, but I am a part of the app that you post content to. So what I do every day is just being able to absorb internet culture, what is happening every day. Things are always changing with internet entertainment. People are always talking about something different. So for me, I really try to understand how can we continue to build community on our app and allow and uplift so many different pieces of content that our users are submitting to us, and then just so that we can create more conversations and increase engagement and viewership for our users.
Great, thanks, Kevin. And then Traci, similarly, can you also talk about what that was like when you were at NBC and then now that you're at Sony?
Yeah, definitely. So I think very similar to what Kevin was saying, you know, using it in two different industries, almost in a way, at least for me. When I was at NBC and prior to that MSNBC, you know, my job was to take this thing called social media, which at the time when I started was very new to a lot of folks, especially using it for news, and introducing it to a platform like broadcast, which never really had to be concerned with what people were talking about on the internet. And so a lot of what I did at both MSNBC and then later at NBC Asian America is really inform people of the ways that you can use social media as a tool to find stories, find sources, kind of treat it as how we can have a two-way conversation with our audience, while at the same time, you know, using these platforms to share information that we felt was the most important. So that's sort of the basics of it, which I think everyone kind of hit on very well. Of course, now at Sony Pictures, I'm specifically focusing on the television department, specifically on our game shows. And we're kind of using it in the same way. It's a two-way conversation, right? It's not just about one-way marketing messaging. It's about how we can engage with the people who are familiar with our brand, who are watching every night, who, you know, have memories or stories that are associated with these shows, and finding the best way to tell their story through our own platforms. So I'm on social media basically 24/7. I was on it 24/7 before, still on it 24/7 now. And it's really just listening to what people are saying, looking for those trends and the different types of conversations that are happening that might affect us, and finding ways to sort of continue the conversations we want to have with our viewers on broadcast online.
Great, thank you all for sharing that. I mean, it's one theme that's sort of I pull out is it's, you know, really important for storytelling, right? Using social media for storytelling. So great. And so I think I want to go over to our next question, which is if we can talk about social media best practices, you know, both for journalists and then just for people in media. And so I want to throw that question out to, we can start with Adrienne and then Traci and then Kevin. So can you talk a little bit, Adrienne, about best practices, specifically for people who work at the LA Times, like what are best practices that the Times has for reporters when it comes to using social media?
Yeah, definitely. So there isn't a requirement for all journalists to be on social. I think it's definitely encouraged. I think the way that the audience team sort of approaches it is that, you know, if you're on, let's say, Twitter as a reporter, we encourage you to share your own stories, but then also in the same token to share your colleagues' stories. I feel like there's a good, helping everybody out within the company for that sort of signal boosting and amplification. I oftentimes reporters will ask, how do I start using Twitter? Or how do I sort of make that brand for myself? And I think my answer is always just to start and to try. You don't have to make it a chore. It is sort of a different muscle that you have to exercise. But I think over time, a few tweets a day, is enough to sort of build up that muscle. I think, everybody has sort of touched on this, but social media is a bit of a listening tool as well. So I feel like leveraging social media and, reading through what people are tweeting at you, questions that people are asking, that in and of itself, I feel like is a reporting tool. So I think we'll probably get into this a little bit later, but I think building a platform for yourself is really important. You are representing the Los Angeles Times brand, or our journalists are at least, but at the same time, you can really show your own voice through your own personal account.
Yeah, I think all of those things are exactly what we kind of told people at NBC as well. I think when we were first getting our reporters and anchors onto, say, a platform like Twitter, especially in 2012, which is almost like the Wild West of the internet, it feels like. It seemed a little scary. People felt like, do I have to be tweeting all the time? Do I need to, do I not show personality because am I representing the company? And I think most news organizations will, they'll obviously say the way that you interact with the world, whether it is online or in person, you do represent, particularly if you're out there for a story, like you are representing the company you work for, right? The two takeaways I always took away from NBC was, the first one was, it's more important to be right than to be first. I think sometimes there's this anxiety that we have of, we see stories breaking, we see people posting, and we want to get in on the conversation, or we want to make sure that, we also show that we've been doing the work, we've been reporting, but every news organization verifies content differently, for instance. And so we're always constantly reminding ourselves, and whether you're doing this in journalism or in any other profession that is related to information sharing, you want to make sure that you are correct with what you're telling people before being the first one. The biggest example that comes to mind for me is the Boston Marathon bombing. And that happened, and there was so much misinformation that was going around, and people were digging into Reddit and tweeting things as if it were facts, and it started confusing a lot of people when they would see reporters engaging in that conversation, because it almost looked like verified reporting. So I think the most important thing is to make sure that you are correct and confident that what you're reporting is not going to be changed in a second, right? And the other thing is also when you are tweeting or posting or whatever, we're always constantly reminding people, you never want to be the person in the headline of like, X reporter from NBC News did blah, 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 right? Like you never want to be that reporter. And so it's just this constant reminder of like, yes, there is something personal about social media and about your online brand, but do keep in mind, especially if you are a journalist who uses the internet to source for stories and talk to people and to gain trust from sources, that you have to be a little mindful of how you're representing yourself as well, because representing yourself on an online platform, just like representing yourself when you're meeting someone in person.
Great. Yeah, I think that's really important. Thank you, Traci. I think there really is like you mentioned, people want to be first. But if you're trying to build trust through social media, then it's okay to come in like a little later, as long as all the facts are correct. And, we've all seen, I think, a lot of instances where there's always corrections run where, oh, it was actually, a female student that died, not a male student, so that's something that I've seen even in local reporting. So it's a really great point. Thank you. And Kevin, I also wanted to ask you about social media practices, best practices, but, shifting, since you come from having been a producer, if you can talk a little bit about best practices when it comes to sharing content. I think with journalists, like we want our content to be shareable, but sometimes maybe if the content is dense, maybe it's a little hard to share that, or if we have a lot of stories we want to share, are there certain stories that we should prioritize sharing that will be more likely to get clicks or get more reads?
Yeah, absolutely. Coming from just a very heavy content creation background, there's really a lot of different things that you can apply as you're creating your pieces of content. And of course, I work really closely with video form content, so it might translate a little bit differently if you're writing an article. However, I think the biggest takeaways really are, you have to understand that whatever piece of content that you're creating, that particular topic has already been talked about in so many different ways. I always like to use an analogy of, you are one person who decided to come to a house party super late, And at this house party, there are multiple groups of people talking about multiple different things. There's a circle of people talking about puppies. There's a circle of people talking about the presidential election, you know, and you're late to the party and you want to insert yourself to one of these conversations that's happening. And at the same time, they're already talking. So how are you going to create a piece of content that feels fresh and new, that offers your own perspective, and something that both makes the story feel human and also connects with everybody, and at the same time puts your own style and voice as a creator out there too. So I think that's something that you really want to consider when you're creating pieces of content that is shareable, that can go viral. And then for me too is like, I also look at a personal philosophy of mine is when you're thinking about content, does it do one of three things? Does it have the potential to elicit some type of emotional response? Does it provide any social knowledge that your audience wasn't aware of before? And or does it provide community? Does it tap into someone's identity that makes them feel seen, or does it feel relatable? All those different things allow your piece of content to be incredibly shareable and viral. And those are the things I always tell people whenever they come to me and ask me, how do I get my content seen on the internet?
Great, thanks, Kevin. I think those are really useful tips that we can maybe even circle back on when we talk about, you know, building a personal brand outside of work. So thank you for sharing those. Great. So I wanted to also, I think this is going to piggyback off the question about, you know, this best practices question is, I want to spend some time talking a little bit about the role of objectivity in journalism. And I think that definitely ties into best practices, right? Because a lot of, you know, there are a lot of journalists that'll cover issues where, you know, there's a lot of inequities, there's a lot of inequality. And where is the line between tweeting about these things? I know we already covered them, right? People will cover these issues, but if you tweet about them, could that be mistaken as advocacy or bias? So what's the best way to go about that? Like to what extent should journalists be sharing their opinions or talking openly about these issues, you know, or sharing their political views or even personal life? And so, yeah, I'd like to kind of pose that question to Seth and Traci. And Seth, if we could start with you, that would be great.
Sure, yeah. So most newsrooms have social media policies. Ours was co-written by Henry Furman, who I'm sure you all know is a longtime AAJA board member. And most of these policies say something along the lines of, you know, avoid writing or posting anything that would embarrass the media company or compromise your ability to do the job. Avoid partisan expressions like supporting a political candidate. Don't use your position to promote a personal agenda or a personal cause. And I imagine these policies exist so media companies can reach the largest audience and could be trusted to provide the unvarnished truth. And so leaving your biases behind, being fair, really trying to listen and understand the other side, both sides, making sure there isn't a hint of conflict of interest. These are all really important and really differentiate us from other less reliable content creators. And so it's important. At the same time, there are some deeper, bigger truths out there that we can and should acknowledge, like institutional racism. I personally think the best way to expose that and talk about that is through the coverage of the various injustices that are happening. So, you know, the hate crimes that were happening after the words of a previous president can be covered by showing the incidents that happened as a direct result, and finding those connections can be brought out through an expert by getting his words or her words out there. And so, I mean, I think that's kind of, I guess, the the stance that I have, or that I'm sure I could go more into it if you have more specific questions.
Yeah, that's 100% how we approached it at NBC as well. You know, if you want to be mindful that you, like you said, aren't tweeting things that would compromise your ability as a reporter to further reach more people or to further gain news sources. I kind of want to hone in specifically on covering something like Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. I think, you know, when we started off with NBC Asian America, and there was a previous editor to myself, and then I did it for about 5 years. When we started off, and then when I left, I think it was very different, right? I think, and a lot of it is just because the internet is different. People understand now more the difference between how people might tweet versus whether an organization is endorsing something, right? And I think one of the questions that always came up when we would, you know, pitch stories or when we would pitch projects, you know, we did quite a few documentaries and web series that were on topics that, you know, didn't necessarily have I don't want to say didn't have an objective line, but when you cover something like the deportation of Cambodian refugees from America to the US, there is something very clear there that you're uncovering that could be seen as biased in some ways, right, by some people. And I think when we sort of weighed the options, or when we weighed that thought of like, would covering it look biased? I think at the end of the day, you have to sort of think about giving coverage to something doesn't necessarily mean you endorse it, right? But you're shining a light on something. And in some ways, you know, for me personally, as somebody who is part of the AAPI community, to know that we're elevating these voices and giving the opportunity for these stories to stand on its own so that people then can further explore and make judgments and educate themselves and make their own opinions about where they might fall on the line of something. I think that's what our role is as storytellers, right? At the end of the day, I'm not telling you what to think because I'm covering the story. I'm covering it because I think it's important enough to be elevated in the national conversation. And we're leading our readers to the place where they can further, you know, seek the truth themselves of what they're hoping to find. Our role as journalists is to dig through all of the facts and all of the information that's out there and talk to the experts, you know, get their voices in there and elevate those stories to a level where people can debate them and talk about them and make those judgment calls in a way that won't require me to create a 20 tweet long thread telling them what they should think, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I kind of have a follow-up question to that. It's sort of, yeah, it's related to you know, the role of objectivity in journalism, but you know, there's also you know, we've seen things where, let's say you're an API covering the API community, and you know, some might say like, oh, well, you might be biased in covering this community because you are part of that community. And I'm wondering, you know, what your thoughts are on that. Like, is it biased to have someone from a specific community covering that community, or is it good, and will that help the reporting process if they have an understanding of the nuances and you know, and have an understanding of the nuances that these communities you know, face?
Yeah, I mean, and I'm not only saying this because this is AAJA and I don't want to feel like I'm pandering here. I'm saying this because I firmly believe it. I firmly believe that having a background and understanding of a community, particularly one that has been so undercovered by the national media for so long, is only a plus, right? Like, to walk into a community where you understand certain sensitivities or cultures. You know, some of the reporters that I worked with at NBC Asian America were bilingual, and that really helped because they were able to understand and have a conversation that perhaps a reporter who has never interacted with the community or has never really spent time sort of deeply immersed in the community might not quite understand, right? It doesn't mean that they won't be able to do the reporting. You know, I think a good journalist is able to walk into any environment and find the story, but I don't think that just because I am an Asian American, it should disqualify me from covering what is seen as Asian American issues, right? At NBC Asian America, we always said we cover everything from politics to pop culture. We don't cover just Asian American politics, right? The stories we cover might heavily focus on the issues that Asian Americans encounter. They might feature Asian American politicians speaking, but this isn't an Asian American politics story. It's a politics story. It's something that affects America. It affects people beyond just our immediate community as well. And that's something that people should care about. And I think by telling Asian Americans that they cannot cover stories that feature Asian Americans, it's almost like you're telling an entertainment reporter they can't go watch movies or they can't cover movies because they watch them, something like that. Like, it just doesn't feel like it's really fair to sort of blame someone's identity for the reason why they can't be objective, because I don't believe that that should disqualify you from, covering a story that you feel deserves national coverage.
Yeah, I'll second what Traci is saying, and take it even a step further. I mean, at the LA Times, we're trying to hire more people that are from the community and represent the community in a better way, and making strong efforts to diversify our newsroom just for that, because they will be better at covering and representing those areas. And so I would say even further than that, you should be getting people from those areas to cover those sections of your community.
Great, thank you so much. I think that's really great. I mean, that sort of veers a little bit off posting about that on social media, but I think, just ties into, people do post about these issues, and so just kind of, figuring out where that line is. So I kind of wanted to transition into our next question, which is what it's like to develop a personal brand, or, develop non-work related projects outside of journalism. I think I want to start maybe with Kevin, if you could talk a little bit about your experience with, having been somebody who is discovered through, you said you were discovered like because of your association with BuzzFeed, but then you also had to maintain a social media presence. And so if you can talk a little bit about what that was like, that'd be great.
Yeah, for sure. I think, for me at my time at BuzzFeed, having been also on camera talent and also creating content as well, that, naturally, because my face was in BuzzFeed videos, and then I became one of the few Asian American faces there, I naturally got a following of folks from the API community, which is phenomenal. And at the same time, I wanted to continue working on my brand and working on outside projects if it allowed. And I think when you're developing this personal brand for yourself, and this applies for everybody a little bit differently, and definitely I would suggest looking into like what your social media policy is with your workplace. But for myself, very luckily with BuzzFeed and Snapchat, I was able to really dive deep into myself and allow a lot of who I am to be present on social media. And so I think when you're developing your brand, what always sticks out most is authenticity. And I think that's just really important because, I would tell like very fresh content creators, and just like, even if you wanted to be an influencer and become quote unquote internet famous, that you have to be authentic to who you are and what your story is. You have to know what's your one line pitch of who you are as an individual so that people get who you are. And I think it's even more daunting when you are someone from an underrepresented community, right? And so in the media, you don't see many people like yourself, then therefore, how do you make yourself as accessible to everybody, but then also be niche and authentic to your own story? And so I really wanted to sit down and figure out my brand as, I am a queer Vietnamese son of immigrants. And this is the type of content you'll see on, my Instagram versus my Twitter. And I get to be really fun and colorful, and then, talk about like my social life, while also luckily being very politically active and sharing just my political views. And so I think there's a lot there to it, but I think at the very core of all that personal brand and work is just figuring out what your story is and how do you want to put that forward and how that can exist and coexist with where you work. I feel like we have a work brand and a work personality, and then developing this personal brand for yourself can look a little different. And I think I would encourage it to look a little different. And it can coexist in this world. And I think that's the biggest challenge for a lot of folks.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Traci, I'm wondering if you can chime in, and I'm specifically interested if you could talk a little bit about, while you were at NBC, you created a podcast with the other editor that was there, and then you also had a social media account dedicated to alopecia. So what was it like for you to develop these things? And also, just to note that these topics are very, very separate from the things that you would do at NBC, right? So what was that like?
Yeah, I've tried telling people at NBC Asian America that we had a podcast about Dawson's Creek. So we started that podcast because we wanted to learn how to podcast. That was the sole intention of creating a podcast. And we chose something that was so separate from what we were doing in our day-to-day, mainly to give us something else to talk about, but also something that didn't have a huge following, really, because it wasn't really streaming anywhere. And that way we're like, if no one listens to it, great, we're trying to learn here. And I think that's the biggest thing, is every sort of non-work project or this, extension of my personal brand or whatever you want to call it that I've done, I try to go into it not looking at the numbers. And I would say for the podcast, we did it for 3 years. And in that 3-year period, we went from having 12 listeners a week to currently, and we've ended it, it's been a year since it's been finished. We still have 7,000 unique monthly downloads, which is crazy, that people all around the world, and we still get emails and DMs from people who tell us things that they love about our podcast, which is wild to us that many people are listening to us, because it scares us. But in that period when we were first starting, I made it a point to not look at the numbers, to not look at how many people were listening. We got a sense of where people were listening from because of emails we would get or reviews. But I think that because I spend my day-to-day online at work very deeply involved in kind of the analytics and the metrics and what it's saying, and building those strategies to grow, for something like a podcast project where the sole intention was just to learn how to do the thing, I didn't want to get bogged down in the numbers of it all, because I think that's one of the most dangerous things about social media too. You can get frustrated and give up if you're not getting immediate progress or something. And so I tried not to think about those things and just think about the story of it. What was I trying to do with this project? Who were the people that were listening? Who was the audience? How was I connecting with them? And, like Kevin said, how can I be the most authentic version of myself, while still also accomplishing all these other things I wanted to do of, connecting with other people who loved the show, right? So that's, separate on the podcast front. And in terms of my alopecia, it's an autoimmune condition that I've had since I was a kid. And that was something for me where I started this Instagram account just to be comfortable with myself and pictures of myself, because particularly alopecia, which affects hair loss, and I lost all my hair when I was about 7 years old. Not a fan of looking at myself in the mirror. And so it sort of started as a personal project for me to just be comfortable in front of a camera and to explore makeup and things like that, because I never had anyone ever teach me how to do makeup because I didn't look, quote unquote, look normal, right? So all these things I felt like I missed out on. And I started this project only a few years ago. And I started to quickly find that there was this community of people on Instagram who were very similar to me. And I met a ton of people that way. And you build this sort of a niche, the community audience. And for me, that was so separate from anything I was doing in my work. But I think it only enhanced what I was doing and what I eventually ended up doing. Part of working at Sony right now at the Creative Center, the whole job is all about trying new things and growth strategies. And not being afraid to fail a little bit, which is really hard for folks who work in television to think about because they're so married to those numbers of who's watching. But I think on the internet, we get a little bit more room to experiment. And so I really wanted to use these personal projects to also experiment a little bit. And, I'm not gonna say I don't look at the numbers ever, but I try not to focus on them as much as I do with the things I do at work. And at the end of the day, the most satisfying things for me with these personal projects and building out this personal brand is like the opportunities that have come from it and just the community I've been able to connect with, because I, put at the front of my mind that the goal here was to learn to connect with people and to be as authentic as I could.
Thanks, Traci. Yeah, so like these things are very, these are very, like these passion projects are very separate again from what you're doing. And so was that, I guess, did it make it easier to be able to do that? I think sort of tying back into like if we were going to share our opinions or things like that, right? Where's that line? Like, was that okay, while you were at NBC to be pursuing things like this? And I guess different newsrooms will have different rules, right? But just wondering what your experience was like.
Yeah, we never, our podcast, it's not like we were making money off of it. And we weren't talking about like NBC related things. So it was never like a, hey, stop doing that, and really at the base of it was NBC at the time was interested in exploring podcasts. They do have quite a robust growing podcast unit now, but they were like, hey, is anyone interested in thinking of projects for this thing? And for me, I'm very much the kind of person that's like, if I'm going to do something, if I'm going to pitch something, I want to know how every part of the process works. And so that's why, we made our own podcast with what we thought was going to be a very small audience that would only last a couple of months, right? But I think every newsroom is going to have a different policy of how much you can do personally. Some people will say you can't, write blog posts or write essays and bylines for other things and stuff like that. For me, I think all the projects I did were so removed from what I did in a day-to-day, and it wasn't like it affected how people saw my authority as a journalist. And I don't know if authority is even the right word here, but for instance, the stuff I was doing with the alopecia community, I was co-hosting a live streamed show on msnbc.com for a period of time. And so much of that, being visible on camera, I think also really kind of, in a way, it was almost like it helps the Instagram account and vice versa, because people were seeing someone who looked different on TV, or not on TV, but in front of a camera. I don't have eyebrows, I wear wigs, like all these different things that I think people who have alopecia who might be looking at it thought that they felt limited by. And I don't want to sound arrogant here and be like, I changed people's perception, because I don't think that's it. But I think it's just contributing to, like, I think those two things can exist simultaneously and support one another. And I don't think it hurt NBC, and I don't think it hurt me personally. So that's kind of how I approached both of those projects.
Great, thanks, Traci. Seth, can you talk a little bit about that? I'm also curious about what the Times rules are about, journalists having their own personal projects online or different online presence that are separate from their work as journalists.
Yeah, I think as long as you clear it with your editor or your manager, and it's not conflicting with what you're doing or what we're doing, it's fine. But you just have to communicate. Yeah, do you want me to talk a little bit about developing personal brand? And a lot of it is really similar to what Kevin and Traci said. It's sort of finding your passion point and really digging into that, and that makes it a lot easier and more natural. So a lot of it's probably good for reporters who have a beat and can do that. When I first started working at the Sun Sentinel, and I don't want to age myself here, but 2008, when you guys were all in high school, they didn't even have a social media policy or thoughts on it or anything. And so I could see it was coming up. And so I started just sunk myself into it and made it my thing, and was just like sending out emails and explaining it to people and having trainings and coaching, and I had a very captive audience in the newsroom. but it went beyond that, and one of the editors there was like, man, you talk about this stuff so much, I think you should just write about it for the paper. And so I started a column and sort of started making my, it was a weekly column that I did there in the print paper. And then I just started making my social media, my Facebook and my Twitter at that time were the big ones. I made them about social media and how to use it and what's happening there and what innovations are happening, and telling people about other. I was also like, in a lot of ways, it's not just about your own passion. I mean, it's about your own passion, but you're so passionate that you talk about what everything else is happening there. So if someone at our competing paper, like the Miami Herald, had a cool column or story, and they had a lot of them, I would share that too, and talk and try to like have a conversation with them and ask them how it happened. And there was just a lot of that. It was just all very natural and genuine, and as Kevin said, authentic. And so that's sort of how I was able to build whatever, I guess, my personal brand back then. At this point, I don't, I spend more time helping content creators do that. I know it's a lot of work, and you really, and it can't feel like work. In order to do it well, it has to feel like you love it and you're passionate about it, and it's just natural and you want to talk about it. I think that's it.
Great, thanks, Seth. Yeah, I think this is really helpful, and I think just knowing that it is okay if you can clear it with your newsroom to do your passion projects and have an online presence, and that's okay. So my next question is about any benefits or repercussions that you've experienced posting on social media. Like, what is the worst thing that's happened? If you could, share or remember any worst thing that happened after you posted something, and also maybe like what's the best thing that's happened, after you've, based on something that you posted on social media. And maybe we can hear from Adrienne. We haven't heard from you in a while, so if you can kind of answer that question, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, definitely. I'm thinking back to a bunch of things that we've done at the LA Times. I guess this is sort of straddles both things. It's a positive and a negative. I think we've had instances in the past where, we've posted stories, on social media that might not have had the best context. So oftentimes, you'll post something on Twitter without reading the story, which oftentimes people don't. The share language alone might not necessarily, tell the best picture of the whole story. And kind of conversely, sometimes a headline might be poorly perceived by people on social. I think people are quite vocal in, quickly responding to those sorts of tweets. And I think for the most part, as audience editors, you are sort of filtering through those sorts of replies and seeing, what sorts of commentary, feedback, questions are valid and which ones aren't. But there have been times, where a headline was written, probably could have been edited a little bit more finely, and folks, responded in an Instagram comment or a Twitter reply. And I think we're very good about, taking those sorts of comments to heart and then making those edits, or asking a reporter or another editor to edit it as, they see fit. So I guess there's that. There was a little bit more of that during election 2020. I think we really needed to make sure that a lot of our social language was obviously A, unbiased, but B, telling, just the facts. I think we sometimes, came into a conflict on social when we were posting, we, had the conversation in their newsroom of, oh, are we, posting videos of Donald Trump's speeches, even though they contain factual inaccuracies. I think, so there's a lot of thinking behind that. So I guess that is my sort of roundabout answer of sort of the more negative repercussions. You really have to think through how you're posting certain things, especially when it comes to political stories. But benefits for social, I guess this is something that, you know, everybody has sort of talked about. I think social media has been our biggest tool for engagement. I'm thinking about all of the creative social media projects that we've done at the LA Times. One of my favorite ones was a while back, we had a podcast about street racing in Los Angeles. It was, you know, just a short project that eventually ended, but we kept that Facebook group going, and it really grew with all of these, you know, street car racing enthusiasts, and people are still posting in it now. So it's kind of interesting to see how communities grow on social. You know, it started off from our project, but then it sort of grew into something else. So seeing things like that is always very encouraging.
Yeah, that's so interesting. That's such a niche though, car racing.
Yeah, it's so funny, but it really, you know, sometimes it is the niche communities that really blow up, and, you know, sort of gain a life of their own. So yeah, pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's very cool. Thank you for sharing that. Kevin, do you have anything that you want to share as far as, you know, consequences or benefits from posting on social media?
Yeah, definitely. I feel like I've experienced the whole gambit. Luckily, nothing too extreme. And I'll say that, like, because I was so much of like a public figure at BuzzFeed during my time there, you know, I think whenever we're creating content or writing stories and your name is attached, your face is attached, your likeness and all of that, I think we are also subject to like criticism. And I think that was something that early on in my career, I knew that I would have mentors and folks always saying like, don't read the comments if you're in a video and all these things. And, you know, like, obviously I'm going to read the comments, you know, I want to know what people are saying about me and all these things. And I didn't realize just like how mean the internet can be and how unrelenting and unfiltered. It's like you hear about it until you are actually involved in it, and then you're like, oh my gosh, like they don't know me, but how can they say those things about me or make certain assumptions? And then it was really wild too, because I remember early on in my time at BuzzFeed, I would appear in a couple videos here and there, and they knew my full name already. And I wasn't even like public facing on social, and they had figured out who I was, all these things. I was just like, oh my gosh, that's so scary. And I think that's something that as folks working in social, we need to be very cognizant of just who we are and the presence that we have. What is our digital footprint? I have had peers who unfortunately have gotten doxxed, and that's really extreme and really scary, but it happens. And I think that's, again, an added layer of just like, how do we, one, put ourselves out there in the most authentic way, and at the same time, how do we also guard ourselves? And it's okay to not share every single detail about your life. I feel like, especially nowadays, when the internet and your presence on the internet requires you to almost be like completely filterless and just share every aspect of your life, that it is okay to not share certain things that you feel like uncomfortable sharing. And I think, you know, you can put a version of yourself out there that you feel is authentic, while also, you know, protecting your peace. And I think that's something that goes really importantly with your mental health while creating on the internet. And then conversely too, you know, like I have also benefited hugely by social media and just posting on social media. And I know the work that I did at BuzzFeed, any opportunity I could push more API content. I especially felt very passionate pushing Vietnamese stories forward, and especially, you know, queer content too. And I think, you know, especially with Southeast Asians and Vietnamese folks, we rarely get to be in the spotlight. And so whenever I would create content around that, just the community really shows up, and they're just like, I've never seen myself in, you know, a BuzzFeed video. And I think that's really beautiful. And, you know, I pitched a story and then I got it made and all of these things. And then it makes people's days, and I would go out in public, and then like young Vietnamese folks would come up to me and they're like, "You're the Vietnamese guy from BuzzFeed." And I think that's just really powerful that like, you know, Traci, you talked about this earlier, that like, sure, like we're not like completely revolutionizing everything, but we are in the room making decisions and putting stories out there that folks of our community have never really seen themselves represented. And I think that's a really powerful tool that social media has allowed us to feel seen and to also feel represented, and that they are not alone. And I think that's the beauty of social media.
Yeah, that's really good. Thanks, Kevin. Seth, do you want to chime in and share your experiences?
Yeah, that was really nice, Kevin. Yeah. I'd say as far as repercussions, there's a few. So we're sort of like the front line with the audience, and there's a lot of stories that come across that we have to make decisions on really quickly. What are we going to say about it? What part are we going to pull? How do we get the whole story? Should we not even share it because it's too controversial? That's a big question that I think is really important, that we have to face all the time. And here's a place where I made a mistake and shared something that I shouldn't have, you know, on reflection. And that, you know, I talk to our group all the time about, like, you don't have to put it out. If it feels icky, if it feels wrong, if it feels like you're going to get backlash, like, you know the audience better than the reporters and the editors and everyone else, because you're talking to them all the time. And so, you know, make that call. And I think one time there was a story about, it was during the whole, like, a lot of the protests were going on, and there was sort of a story about police dancing with some of the protesters, and the story was supposed to be this sort of feel good, you know, like story, and it gave me pause, and it felt weird and off target, or off, the timing wasn't right, but I put it out there because it you know, the reporter worked hard on it, was asking if I could put it out there, and you know, the feedback after that was like, you know, the whole, it was very much like the propaganda thing, and I just felt terrible because, like, it sparked like a lot of very intense conversation in the newsroom, that had I just not put that tweet out there, it maybe would have alleviated a lot of pain for people. But I think it was an important discussion to have, and it brought us through a lot of stuff. But it is something to think about, and trust your instincts when you're thinking about your audience. And if something doesn't feel right, this is what we talk about all the time, like, pause, run it by other people, you know, don't just throw it out there just to throw it out there. And then I just think also, like, wording can be really tricky. When I was the editor at the Poynter Institute, we had I can't remember if it was an intern or a fellow, who put out a tweet about The View. I think it was The View, something about The View. There were some media companies who moved into the new towers that was built, the new tower that was built, and it was talking about the like, you could only get a better view from a plane, and it was just really off. Like, couldn't be worse. Like, the Washington Post media reporter called me for comments to say, like, what were you guys thinking? And so, like, he didn't mean anything wrong. He was, you know, but it's just something where, like, language can be tricky, and you have to be really careful and read it over, have other people, you know, read it over as much as you can. Everyone needs an editor. So those are some of the repercussions that can be painful. Some of the benefits is, you know, I think sometimes it can be a time suck. I think, like, real experiences with real people are more important, and, you know, that's really, like, not honest, like, about social media is, like, you can really get hooked into it. I find myself looking at my phone all the time, checking it, seeing, you know, like, did anybody like my tweet or whatever. Like, there's just a lot of time invested into it that, you know, you could just be talking to someone.
Thanks, Seth. And Traci, do you want to chime in and share about your experiences?
Yeah, I think, you know, when it comes to repercussions, and this is kind of answering one of the questions I see in the chat, you know, when I started at MSNBC, it launched MSNBC.com, and a lot of us who were also digital producers and video producers were also writing pieces. So it was breaking news, hits. We were starting to veer into, I guess, what's now considered like feature territory, right? But I was covering things like gun control and marriage equality and climate change, which are all very popular topics people love to talk about on the internet. And, you know, at the time when you're writing that stuff, you've got your byline that's connected to your Twitter account. And at the time, you know, people still do this, they feel comfortable putting their email address in their Twitter bio and stuff like that. I definitely got my fair share of I don't know, I mean, trolls, I guess, like essentially people who really hated me and MSNBC and the coverage and, you know, anything MSNBC did, whether I was involved or not, like, because my name is on a website associated with the brand, you know, I get all of the tweets about it and the emails and things like that. I think, you know, the worst, I've fortunately never been doxxed, but you know, you get now I can call them empty threats, but especially at a time when we were covering, you know, the end of 2012 going into 2013, where it really felt like we were covering mass shootings every 2 weeks, and especially right after Sandy Hook, and you know how sensitive the political conversations were around that and the NRA at the time. You know, I got a lot of emails that were very threatening. But luckily NBC has a wonderful security department to help handle that. So those are all sort of things that I would consider, I don't know if repercussion is the right thing, but that's the negative side to it, right? You are public facing and you do have this opportunity to connect with people and create communities, but you know, there are going to be people out there who don't necessarily interact with you in the most positive way, right? I did learn that, you know, the block button on Twitter is great. Things like that are really helpful. You know, it really gave me also a quick crash course in security online. So like how to secure your accounts to make sure that they're not going to be hacked, and making sure privacy settings and stuff like that. Like all of those things I think are really helpful and beneficial to anyone who is in any sort of public facing role. So, you know, I think that's kind of a weird blessing that came from it, and just being able to learn all that stuff and, you know, pass my paranoia on to other people that I know. And that also helps even now in what I do too. You know, I sit here all day and read what people are saying about these 2 game shows that I work for, both positive and negative. And you know, when you read so many hate tweets that are kind of deeply entrenched in politics for a while, like people's anger about other things is not as intense. So I can like learn to separate my own personal, like I'm feeling attacked versus like, this is just people venting online, you know, things like that. So I think learning how to draw those lines between like how people who don't know you perceive you on the internet based on like 1 or 2 things versus like not letting my own mental health be like dragged down by people saying mean things to me on the internet.
Yeah, thanks. And so we have a couple of questions in the chat, but I think one thing that some of you brought up was relating to mental health. And I would love if, I'm just going to throw this out to whoever wants to answer, is, you know, with a job where you have to be on social media, whether that's in journalism or just, you know, in a media company, what do you do to take care of your mental health? You know, I mean, in journalism, you have to be on there responding to people or looking for stories, and, you know, that can get overwhelming sometimes. So whoever wants to share, I'd really be curious to hear about what you do to make sure that it doesn't get the best of you and that you take care of your mental health, you know, while still, you know, balancing using social media.
Talk about that a little bit. So obviously, you know, running the LA Times social media accounts gets really tiring. I've felt in the past that it was kind of hard to strike a good balance and to sort of draw boundaries. for me, you know, I love breaking news and I always want to know what's going on. But I've also found that that is pretty taxing on my own personal mental health. So in trying to draw better boundaries, I, on all of my personal accounts, pretty much unfollowed most media accounts and news accounts. I think it was kind of a big drastic move, but it was kind of the only way for me to separate personal life and work life. I found like a pretty good solution for that. So for my own personal Twitter account, I unfollowed all the news accounts, but then I just made a Twitter list of all of those news accounts, put them on the Twitter list, and then like added it as a column on TweetDeck. So when I'm off work, I don't see it on my timeline, and I can sort of use Twitter for more like personal use or like networking use. But then when I'm at work, it's really easy to just pull all those things up and then to see it. But yeah, I think just making sure that you're, you know, intentionally trying to separate work and life.
Yeah, I 100% do the same thing. I also don't have push notifications on because I think that would just drive me crazy to see it on my phone all the time, of just like, for my personal accounts, like, do I need, and I think that also helps me check it less. You know, I try really hard to not immediately open Twitter the first thing in the morning, right? Because I think that's sometimes our instinct, especially in news. I think I did that all the time. Like when I was at NBC, first thing I did was look on all my social media. I always tell myself, like, you're not going to be able to read everything on Twitter. So like, why do you need to spend 6 hours scrolling on it? But yeah, I think, you know, Adrienne absolutely hits the nail on the head there, like really trying to draw personal boundaries of like not letting what you do from your 9 to 5 or whatever those hours are, like also take over what you do at the dinner table, right? Like I try really hard to like put my phone on the, it's hard in quarantine, I think, because we're all just like trapped in our houses with only our technology to connect us to the world. But like, I try really hard to say like, okay, all the technology work stuff is going to be over there in that corner while I do other things, like listen to a podcast or, you know, watch something on Netflix or something like that. Yeah, I have to really intentionally remind myself, I think quite often, because it's so natural to just like go to the phone and get lost in what's happening on in the internet.
Great, thanks, Traci. Kevin or Seth, do you want to chime in? We also have a couple more questions. I know we're running a little over time, but I wanted to get maybe 1 or 2 questions. But if Seth or Kevin, if you want to chime in on that question, you don't have to though. Okay, let's dive into there's a couple of questions. I don't think we'll be able to get to everything, but somebody is asking, if you mess up a tweet with typos, or if there are errors in your tweet, should you delete that and then repost it? Or will you lose your audience? Or I've also seen some people just reply to the tweet with an asterisk, but what would you suggest is the best thing to do?
So what we do is you mean for your own personal account or for news? I mean, we try very hard to never delete anything we put out there, unless it's putting out bad information that will confuse people. And if that's the case, we'll reply to that email, to that tweet or post or whatever, to say, I mean, in Facebook, you can edit it, but in Twitter, like we'll reply and to say, hey, this is some bad information. We're going to delete this and we'll put out the correct information, but here's the mistake. And then we'll put out a new tweet that has the correct information. So in that rare instance where we've put out information that's completely wrong and it may be confusing to people, that's when we'll delete it.
Great, and I just want to move on to, so we have time to do at least one more question. Jaira is asking, have any of you been harassed on social media or faced discrimination because of the work you do? And then just to add on to that, if that's something you've experienced, how do you respond to that?
Ignore, block.
Yes, blocking is a wonderful tool. Yeah, I think when it comes to harassment, like people online seem it's funny the way that someone phrased it to me, because I think in every profession you're gonna have trolls. Someone phrased it to me was like, wow, that's what they really chose to spend their day doing, huh? Like, you don't know these people. And sometimes all of those like trolling kind of harassment and stuff like that, like it can feel very personal. I really just have to fully separate myself from that platform, like it sucks because I don't know if there's one way to deal with it. And it so depends on the context of what they're sending, how they're sending it and stuff like that. I just immediately default to blocking or muting. Muting is also a great tool because blocking sometimes seems to anger people more. And just kind of clean it up that way.
Great. There was a question about thoughts on blocking, so that knocked out 2 questions in one. So thanks, Traci. Great. Well, we are running a little over time, so I think we'll wrap with that question. And just wanted to thank everybody who attended. Thank you so much for spending an hour of your evening with us, and just thank you to all our panelists, Adrienne, Kevin, Seth, and Traci. This was such a great discussion, and it'll be going up online. So, folks who aren't able to attend or maybe want to rewatch it will have the opportunity to do that. I also just wanted to invite everybody that's watching for future events. If you'd like to just be updated on that, you can follow AAJA LA on Instagram. It's at AAJA_LA. Our next event is going to be on August 6th, which will be about freelancing. So the Instagram account will have more details on that. But yeah, thank you so much, everybody. This was such a great discussion. I really appreciate everybody being here. And hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening.